Hi guys, it's Courtney and welcome. I am very excited to be a guest on Dana's channel for her Christmas card series. And today I am going to be creating a long card, and this one is actually going to be vertical. I'm using the Christmas sELFies stamp set by MFT, and I'm using 3 individual pictures, I guess you could call them. And I want this to kind of appear kind of like those photos that you get from a photo booth, how it's like a strip of photos. So I'm taking 3 of these. I am using my Misty just to make sure that I can line these up correctly. I'm kind of eyeballing it. I'm not doing any measuring, but when I close my Misty door, I'm going to use the grid lines on the Misty door just to make sure that everything is lined up correctly before I actually stamp these images out. This is a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I am stamping with my favorite Copic Safe ink, the Blackout ink by Ink on 3. I did stamp these twice. Number one, it is the first time I'm stamping these images, and also they're kind of large and it takes up pretty much the whole panel. So I wanted to make sure that I got a crisp image for all of them. So next we're going to move right on to the Copic coloring, which is pretty much the entire card. And I'm going to start off with my background, and I want the background of each one of these little photographs to have kind of a light blue backdrop, I guess you could call it. I'm using a B00, which is a pretty light blue, and I definitely would suggest doing this first if this is something you're plan on doing, because it is such a light color. If I happen to go not out of the lines, but in the lines, I can easily cover it up with my regular coloring. And also being I'm going to be using darker colors for the actual images, especially reds, they tend to bleed a little bit. So if I were to color all of my images first and then accidentally, even just the tiniest bit, touch the tip of this blue marker to that red, it's going to drag that color to areas that I don't want it to be. So I like to do my backgrounds first, especially when I am using such a light color. So I use this B00 on all 3 of my little pictures, and I just did it. I just colored it in solid. I didn't do any shading. Then we are going to jump into the coloring of the actual images. Going to start off with the skin tones for the elves, and I'm using the same skin tone combination for all of them. There's actually 2 separate elves here, but they are in all 3 pictures. So I like to start off with my lightest color. First, I like to saturate the paper. The more saturated the paper is, the better blend you're going to get. And I also like to map out my darkest areas. That way, in case I make a mistake and add a shadow I don't want it to be in, I can easily cover that up with the lightest color, but I couldn't necessarily do that if I jumped right in with the darkest. So I'm just adding a little bit of shading where their hat is over their face. His little hand is closed or somewhat closed, so that would create a shadow. And on the inside of their little ears, there is kind of a line there within the illustration of the stamp. So I'm just using that to my advantage to kind of guide me as far as where my shading should be. I colored the other 3 elves with the same color combination and pretty much stuck to the same shading as far as my shadows and highlights go. I wanted to add a little bit of color to their cheeks, so I'm going to bring out an R20, and I'm just flicking from the outer portion of their face towards the center of their face. And when you're adding cheek color, if it ends up being a little bit too bright and vibrant, you can go back in with your lightest skin tone color. In my case, it's an E50, and very quickly go over their cheeks again. And this will kind of tone it down a little bit, but not necessarily blend it out. So next I'm going to move on to their hair, and this first little elf here, I'm going to make him have red hair. So I'm going to use 3 different colors here, and there's not a whole lot of their hair showing, so you probably wouldn't necessarily need to use all 3 colors, but I'm just adding a little bit of shading underneath their hat, and it looks like he's got kind of curly hair or wavy hair, so I'm kind of using that to my advantage. When I went in with my highlight color, which is actually a yellow, it ended up being a little bit lighter than I wanted it to be. So I went back in with that mid-tone color and just added a little bit more of that. That way his hair wasn't so bright. I wanted to add a few freckles to his cheeks. So I'm taking that E09 and just with the tip of my marker, just adding a few dots on his cheeks. For this next elf here, he has very little hair showing underneath his hat. He's just got a few little strands there. So you don't have to do any shading here. You could go in with one color, maybe even two, but I ended up going in with 3 colors, just adding the darkest area where his hair is kind of tucked underneath the hat, blending that out with the mid-tone, and then finishing off with that E55. Next, I'm going to move on to Santa's skin tone, and I'm going to do my shading pretty similar here, but I am using a little bit of a different color combination. But again, I'm starting off with that lightest color. Now for his nose, I'm doing the shading a little bit different for his nose. I'm adding a little bit of shading to the bottom portion of it, but I'm leaving a little bit of a highlight from that area where I'm adding the shading to that black outline, if that makes any sense at all. And this will kind of just give it a little bit more dimension. I didn't want to go in with just the lightest color for his nose because it's huge and it needed a little bit of shading to it. So next we're going to move on to Santa's beard, and I wanted, obviously he's got a white beard, but anything that's white still has shadows. So I'm going to use my C markers here, and I'm starting off with the C5, and I'm adding some shading where his little cheeks and his nose are kind of hanging over his beard, as well as where his mouth is. And you can see that there's a lot of texture in Santa's beard. Well, naturally, there's a lot of texture in Santa's beard. So to kind of maintain that, when I go in with my C3, I'm extending those areas out, but I'm also creating little C's all over his beard. I'm going to do the same thing with the C1. I'm going to extend those areas out where we added our shading, and I'm going to add even more of those little C shapes. Doesn't really matter which direction you go, it's just easier for me to make little C's. And then I'm going to finish off with this C00, and I'm going to go over the entire area. Now a C00 is literally one step above a colorless blender, so it's not going to give you too much color, but it's going to have all of these little C lines kind of blend together, so it just leaves the texture, but you don't see the little C's anymore. So I'm going to use some C markers for his little eyebrows, as well as the base or the bottom portion of his hat. Again, I wanted the bottom portion of his hat to be white, so I am leaving some white space here. I'm just going to add the shadows. So next I'm going to move on to the greens, and I'm going to kind of switch up the green combination as I go along here, but I'm going to show you what I started with and how I colored this first hat. Again, I am starting off with that lightest color to map out the darkest areas and to get my paper saturated a little bit. Now this hat is kind of curved or kind of bent, squiggly a little bit. So I'm using those squiggly lines to add some shadows there to kind of go along with the shape. So wherever it's indented in, I'm adding a little bit of a shadow there. And I'm just going along with the shape of the image itself. And then each time I move down towards that G02, which at this point is my lightest color, I'm just going to extend those areas out a little bit more. Now I colored the other hat there on the middle picture and his outfit, I believe, with the same color combination. And honestly, I just wasn't getting the contrast I was looking for. If you've ever watched any of my videos before or seen any of my cards, I like to see that contrast. I like to use a very scary dark color and a very scary light color, which is how you get that contrast. And I just wasn't seeing it with the color combination I was using now. I had the scary dark, which is that G28 or G29, but the G02 just wasn't light enough. So what I ended up doing is I ended up taking out one of the mid-tone colors and using the G02, which at this point is my lightest color, as my lightest mid-tone, and brought in the G00 as my highlight color. And as I'm doing the coloring here, you'll see that this makes a huge difference, and just having that stronger highlight will give you that contrast in your coloring that you're looking for. So if you are Copic coloring or coloring with your alcohol markers and you're not getting that contrast that you're looking for, try adding just a tiny bit of a really scary dark color and a really scary light color, and I promise you, you'll notice a difference. Now to lighten up the areas that of the hats that I've already colored, I'm just going to go in with that G02 and quickly go over those highlight areas, and that will lighten it up a little bit. Think of the lighter colors as a colorless blender with just a little bit of pigment. So they are going to react very similar. So a colorless blender doesn't blend color, it kind of moves it around. So a light color like a G00 going over a darker area is going to react the same way. So just keep that in mind if you ever make any coloring mistakes or kind of want to switch things up. You can certainly use a light color to help you out with that. So I'm just finishing up these green areas here. I'm just finishing up with his little outfit, and I'm liking the contrast that I'm getting with this combination much better. So once all of my green areas were colored, we're going to move on to Rudolph, and I'm going to bring out some E30 markers for him. And again, like always, starting off with that lightest color to get those areas or those dark areas mapped out. I'm just going to add a little bit of shading. He's kind of standing behind Santa, so Santa might be adding a little bit of a shadow onto Rudolph, and also underneath his little chin and kind of where his antlers are coming together. Going to go right in with that darkest color next, then blend that out with the two midtones, and then finish off with that lightest color that we had started with. I'm saving his nose till last. I did color in his, or added a little bit of color to his antlers. I didn't do any shading, but I'm saving his nose till last. I'm going to move on to the red combination next, which I always save till last. Whenever I'm coloring, especially Christmas cards, we tend to use a lot of reds. I always save my reds till last. Like I said in the beginning, they tend to end up in places that you don't want them to go. And I don't want to start off with reds because they're hard to get up. A colorless blender doesn't necessarily take away red. So I am going to start off with my R22, which is my highlight color. And for this hat, or the bottom portion of this little elf's hat, I'm going to just add some shading on either side. And for the ornament, this is a round object, so it would have a center highlight. But you can see just on one side, I'm leaving a little bit of white space between where I'm placing my shadow and the black outline, kind of like I did with Santa's nose. And for an object like an ornament, this is going to add a little bit of shine to it. We will add some white gel pen details to add even more shine later, but this will certainly help with your coloring as well. So this is my favorite red combination for sure. I tend to use it for every single card. I think these colors blend beautifully together and gives just the amount of shadows and highlights. So finishing off again with that lightest color that we started with, that R22 for that highlight. And you can see now that that ornament is done, that little highlight off to the left-hand side really adds a lot of dimension. So I am going to show you these two bottom hats here because these are bent. The other two in the center are pretty much the same as I have been coloring this entire time. But for these two hats, especially Santa's, you can see they're kind of bent or folded down. So in order to kind of go along with the shape of their hats, I'm adding one flick just where it's bent. It's kind of part of the illustration anyway, but I'm just extending that flick out a little bit further than what's in the image itself. And then each time I blend out, I'm going to just extend that flick out a little bit more. I'm making it a little bit thicker and I'm making it a little bit longer. Now this is going to look a little crazy in the beginning, especially when you're starting with your darkest color and kind of moving back. But keep going. A lot of times when we're doing coloring with any medium, not necessarily just Copics, it looks bad before it looks good. So if you're not happy with it, I promise you keep going. You're going to be very surprised with your results. So again, just finishing off here with the R22 for my highlight color, and you can see now that that's kind of all come together. So for Rudolph's nose, I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to the bottom portion of his nose and just leave that top portion for that center highlight. For smaller areas, sometimes I will go right in with my darkest color. I really don't have too much of a problem blending, especially with this color combination. Last, I wanted to go in and add, oh, first I forgot this little guy's part of this jacket here. I added a little bit of shading because I wanted this to appear white, and I was just super careful not to touch any of those red areas. Now for their little bells that are on the top portions of their hats, I'm going to go right in with that darkest color, which is the E99, blend that out with the Y26 and the Y23. Yellows can be a little tough, so you tend to have to use either an orange or an E marker for your shadows, and in this case, I wanted it to be more of a golden yellow, so I used the E99. So next, now that oops, I forgot their little buttons, just add a little bit of shading with the C7, C5, and C3 for their little buttons there on their little outfits, as well as the top portion of this ornament. I guess it would be like the metal part that holds the ribbon. So once all of my coloring was complete, I wanted to add some shimmer because in my opinion, a Christmas card is not complete without some shimmer. So I'm using this liquid pixie dust by Ink on 3, and I just got this, and I know it's been around for a little bit, but this is the first time I'm using it. And I'm just going to squeeze a little bit onto an acrylic block. I always use an acrylic block as my palette, and I'm using a paintbrush, and I'm only adding a tiny bit at a time. This is not watercolor paper. I did not show you the first one because I was off camera, but you can see that I'm just going in a little bit at a time and kind of spreading this out fairly quickly. It dries quick. It seeps into the paper quick. And it may be different if I were to use watercolor paper, but in this case, it's just regular old cardstock. So I wanted to kind of move quickly. But as you can see, it leaves behind so much shimmer, much more than any other shimmer pen or any of those glitter pens that we use, which I love and I use all the time. But this is unbelievable how much shine and how even it comes out. So I really, really like the results of that. Next, I'm going to add some white gel pen details, and this is also something that can really boost up your coloring if you're not 100% happy with it. This will add a little bit more of a highlight to some of your coloring just by adding some white gel pen details. Just make sure that you're kind of going in the direction or the shape of whatever image you're adding them to, and this, like I said, will really boost everything up. So once my coloring and all of my details were added, I am going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiment from this same stamp set with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I didn't really leave room for a sentiment, so I'm just going to plop that down right on the bottom portion of my card panel. Next, I'm using my Tombow Mono Multi-Glue to adhere this panel to a piece of black cardstock that is cut just slightly larger than this panel, and then adhere this to my white card base. So that way I have a nice border on all 4 sides. I prefer to use the Tombow Mono Multi-Glue or any wet glue because it gives me a couple of seconds to move things around because I never seem to line things up right. I finished up with some glossy accents just to Rudolph's nose and the ornament, and that is it. That is the card. I will leave all of the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you so much to Dana for having me as a guest on her channel. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.